The contract expired at midnight, and with a single cold signature, Liam erased 3 years of my devotion. I walked out into the pouring rain, clutching a secret that was supposed to change our lives, a tiny ultrasound tucked against my heart. But while he was slipping a diamond onto her finger under the bright gala lights, I was losing our child on a cold hospital gurney, screaming his name into the silence. I won the settlement, but I lost the only world I ever loved. Now he's banging on my door, begging for a second chance he doesn't deserve. But how do you fix a heart that died the same night his contract ended? If you enjoy emotional and dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next episodes. Every subscription motivates us to keep bringing you better stories every day. And now we're curious. Where are you watching from? And what are you doing while watching this video? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where our viewers are around the world. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 12, each chime echoing through the silent mansion like a nail being driven into a coffin. I sat at the dining table, my hands folded tightly over a velvet box containing a pair of engraved cufflinks, a gift for our 3rd anniversary. The candles had long since burned down, leaving only the acrid scent of wax and the cold remains of a dinner I had spent 5 hours preparing. I heard the heavy oak door groan open, followed by the rhythmic, indifferent click of his Italian leather shoes on the marble floor. Liam didn't head for the kitchen or the stairs. He walked straight to the table, his presence bringing a chill that the fireplace couldn't warm. He didn't look at the dinner, nor did he look at me. Instead, he pulled a thick, manila envelope from his briefcase and tossed it onto the table, sliding it over my anniversary gift as if it were nothing more than a nuisance. "It's midnight, Elara," he said, his voice as sharp and clinical as a surgeon's blade. "Check the date. The 3 years are up. Our contract officially expired 60 seconds ago." I felt the air vanish from my lungs, my chest tightening until it physically ached. I looked down at the envelope, the bold, black letters of termination of marital agreement staring back at me like a death sentence. My throat felt like it was filled with broken glass, but I managed to whisper, "Liam, it's our anniversary. I thought maybe we could talk about us. About everything we've shared." He let out a short, dry laugh that made my blood run cold, his eyes finally meeting mine with a terrifying emptiness. "Shared? We didn't share a life, Elara. We shared a transaction. I paid your mother's medical bills, and you played the role of the perfect, silent wife to keep the board of directors off my back. You were an employee with a ring, nothing more." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a gold fountain pen, and tapped it against the table. "I've already signed. There's a check inside for $2 million a bonus for your service. I want you out of this house before the sun comes up." The room began to spin. Every memory of him holding me when I was sick, every gentle touch I thought was real, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I reached out, my fingers trembling so violently I could barely touch the paper. "Was it all a lie? Even the night you stayed awake with me when my father passed? Was that a transaction too?" Liam's expression didn't soften. If anything, it grew harder, more impatient. I was protecting my investment. "A grieving widow looks bad for the company's image. Don't make this pathetic, Elara. It's over." Just as the first sob threatened to break through my throat, the front door swung open again. I turned, expecting a servant, but my heart stopped. A woman stood there, draped in a silk trench coat, carrying a designer suitcase. It was Sarah, the woman he had supposedly forgotten years ago. She didn't look like a stranger. She looked like she owned the place. She walked straight to Liam, sliding her arm through his with a possessive smirk that told me everything I never wanted to know. Liam didn't pull away. Instead, he looked at her with a warmth I had spent 3 years begging for. He then turned back to me, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a final blow to my soul. "I've already moved your things to the hallway. Sarah needs the master suite tonight. After all, she's the reason this contract existed in the first place." I stood there, paralyzed, watching Sarah's slender fingers trail possessively across the lapel of Liam's midnight blue suit, the very one I had meticulously steamed for him just hours ago, imagining a romantic evening that was nothing but a hallucination. The air in the grand dining hall grew heavy with the scent of her cloying, expensive jasmine perfume, a fragrance so sharp it seemed to choke out the lingering aroma of the home-cooked meal now turning to stone on the table. Sarah didn't look at me with anger. She looked at me with pity, the kind one reserves for a stray dog that had overstayed its welcome in a luxury hotel. Her eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the room, lingering on the family photos on the mantel as if she were already mentally rearranging the furniture. I was no longer the mistress of this house. I was a glitch in the system of their reunion, a temporary placeholder for a life that had been promised to her long before I ever signed that cursed manila envelope. "The hallway, Liam?" I finally whispered, my voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "You let the staff throw my life into cardboard boxes and stack them like unwanted freight in a corridor?" I looked at the man I had loved with a desperation that now felt like a sickness, searching for even a ghost of the husband who had once held me through the night when my mother's heart stopped. But that man was a carefully crafted illusion, a performance he had put on to ensure his investment remained stable. The stranger standing before me now was the true Liam, a man who measured human devotion in profit margins and exit clauses. He didn't even flinch at the tremor in my hands. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks, the old ones, not the gift I had bought with a clinical indifference that was more agonizing than a scream. "Efficiency is a virtue, Elara," he replied, his tone as flat as a dial tone. "The car will be here at 5 a.m. I'd suggest you spend your remaining hours checking those boxes. I'd hate for you to leave anything behind that I'd be forced to incinerate once Sarah begins her redecoration tomorrow." The sheer, calculated cruelty of his words felt like a serrated blade twisting in my abdomen. I looked at the $2 million check lying on the table, the numbers mocking the 3 years of my youth I had sacrificed for his peace of mind. "You think this paper covers the cost of my soul, Liam? You think it pays for the nights I spent defending your reputation while you were secretly longing for a woman who left you when you had nothing?" Sarah let out a soft, melodic laugh that set my nerves on fire. She stepped toward me, her silk heels clicking sharply on the marble, and reached out to mockingly brush a stray hair from my forehead. "Oh, honey, don't be so dramatic," she cooed, her breath smelling of champagne and victory. "Liam is being generous. Most temp workers don't get a 7-figure severance package. Why don't you take the money and find a nice little apartment somewhere far away from our zip code? Maybe a place with fewer mirrors so you don't have to see what a failed marriage looks like every morning." A sudden, violent wave of nausea surged from the pit of my stomach, making the world tilt on its axis. I pressed my palm against my belly, feeling a sharp, rhythmic throbbing that terrified me. I thought of the secret I carried, the tiny life that was supposed to be our bridge, now a lonely island in a sea of betrayal. I looked at the check again, feeling a surge of visceral disgust. With shaking fingers, I picked it up and began to tear. I tore it slowly, watching the ink of his signature split apart. Then I shredded it into 100 tiny white flakes that I let fall onto the cold marble like ash. "I came here with a heart full of hope, and I'm leaving with nothing but the truth," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously steady whisper. "Keep your blood money, Liam. You're going to need it to buy back the conscience you sold." Liam's face darkened into a mask of pure fury, a vein throbbing in his temple as he stepped into my personal space, his shadow suffocating me. "You're acting like a martyr to hide your greed, Elara. It's pathetic. You signed the contract. You knew the expiration date." He leaned down, his eyes boring into mine with a hatred that extinguished my last spark of hope. "Now get out of my sight before I have security drag you to the curb." As I turned to flee, a sudden, agonizing cramp doubled me over, a hot flash of pain radiating through my hips. I clung to the banister, my breath coming in ragged gasps, praying that the child of a man who had no heart could somehow survive the wreckage of mine. Behind me, I heard the sound of their glasses clinking in a toast, a celebration of my erasure. I dragged my body away from the dining room, each step feeling as though my shoes were made of lead, while the echoes of their clinking crystal followed me like a funeral march. The hallway was exactly as Liam had described, a cold, dimly lit corridor lined with utilitarian brown boxes that held the remains of my 3-year existence. Seeing my life reduced to cardboard and packing tape was a fresh humiliation, a physical manifestation of how easily I could be erased from his world. I reached for the nearest box, my fingers brushing against the framed photo of our wedding day that sat precariously on top. In the picture, I was beaming, looking at Liam with a gaze full of naive devotion, while he, I now realized with a sickening jolt, was looking past the camera, his mind likely already counting down the days until this contract would expire. I wanted to smash the glass, to scream until the walls crumbled. But another sharp, twisting cramp seized my abdomen, forcing a strangled gasp from my lips. I slumped against the wall, clutching my stomach, the secret life within me feeling like a fragile bird caught in a collapsing cage. "You're still here?" I thought I smelled something stale lingering in the air. Sarah's voice drifted from the doorway, dripping with a sugary malice that made my skin crawl. She walked toward me, her silk robe billowing behind her like a shroud, and stopped just inches from my face. She reached out, pretending to help me steady myself, but as her hand brushed my ear, she leaned in and whispered with a jagged edge to her voice, "I put it in your left coat pocket, Elara. Liam loves a clean break, and nothing is cleaner than a criminal record." Before I could even process her confession, she stepped back, wearing a mask of faux concern. It's a shame, really. A woman should have more dignity than to fall in love with a man who only hired her for her silence. I looked up at her, my vision blurring, but I refused to let a single tear fall. "I'm taking nothing but my memories, Sarah, and trust me. After tonight, I wouldn't wish them on my worst enemy." I struggled to my feet, using the wall for support, and grabbed the handles of my smallest suitcase. The nausea was returning in waves, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. But as I turned toward the grand entrance, the heavy oak doors swung open. It wasn't the car I had expected. It was Marcus, Liam's head of security, flanked by 2 other men. They didn't look at me. They looked at Sarah, then at the boxes with a grim, professional hunger. Liam appeared at the top of the staircase, looking down at us like a god presiding over a ruin. He didn't even look at me. He simply checked his watch, his posture radiating a terrifying, absolute power. "Before you leave, Elara, there's one more thing," he stated, his voice booming in the cavernous hall. "I've noticed the sapphire necklace from the vault is missing. Given your theatrical refusal of the check, I can only assume you've secured your own bonus." My heart stopped. "You think I'm a thief?" I cried out, the injustice burning hotter than the pain in my womb. Liam didn't answer. He simply nodded to Marcus, then deliberately turned his back to me, staring out the window at the rain as if I no longer existed. I watched in horror as the security team began to rip open my boxes, tossing my clothes and my private journals onto the cold marble floor. They searched with a violent efficiency, scattering my dignity like autumn leaves. Suddenly, Marcus pulled the velvet pouch from my coat pocket. He opened it, and the deep blue stones of the sapphire necklace tumbled out. I looked at Sarah, whose eyes were dancing with silent laughter, and then at Liam's frozen back. "I didn't do this. Liam, look at me!" I screamed, but he didn't turn. Instead, the faint, haunting wail of sirens began to rise from the end of the driveway, a sound too perfectly timed to be a coincidence. He had called them before he even told me to leave. The terror and the betrayal culminated in a sudden, agonizing explosion of pain in my lower back. I felt a terrifyingly warm, wet sensation spread across my thighs, soaking into the fabric of my dress. I looked down, and through the haze of my agony, I saw the first drop of blood hit the white marble, right next to the stolen sapphires. Liam finally turned, his eyes widening for a split second as he saw the red staining the floor, but the police were already through the door. My knees buckled, and as the world began to turn black, the last thing I saw was Liam stepping back, his face contorting into a mask of disgust rather than pity, as if my life's blood was just another mess he had to pay someone to clean up. The siren's wail grew deafening, a frantic, rhythmic screaming that blurred with the thumping of my own heart as I lay collapsed on the frigid marble. The world was shrinking, narrowed down to the sight of my own blood blooming like a dark, cursed flower against the pristine white stone, right beside those mocking sapphires. The police officers moved in, their heavy boots thudding near my head, but their voices sounded like they were underwater. I felt a pair of hands grab my shoulders not to comfort me, but to hoist me up for the camera of an officer's body cam. Through the haze of pain, I caught a final glimpse of Liam. He was standing several feet away in the shadows of the grand staircase, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of absolute chilling detachment. He wasn't looking at the life draining out of me. He was looking at the sapphire necklace that Marcus was placing into an evidence bag. To him, the recovery of a piece of jewelry was a successful business recovery. My collapse was merely a messy legal inconvenience. "She's faking it," I heard Sarah whisper, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet concern that didn't reach her triumphant eyes. Liam, she's just trying to avoid the handcuffs. It's a classic move by women of her background. I tried to speak, to tell them that something was dying inside me, but my voice was a broken rasp, drowned out by the rain lashing against the windows. The pain in my abdomen intensified into a sharp, searing heat, as if a white-hot iron was being twisted in my gut. As the officers realized I wasn't responding to their commands, the atmosphere shifted from an arrest to a medical emergency. Someone called for an ambulance, and for a fleeting second, Liam's eyes flickered toward mine. For one heartbeat, I thought I saw a crack in his granite exterior, a shadow of the man who had once promised to protect me. But then he looked at the blood on his white marble floor, his lip curling in a faint expression of annoyance at the stain, and he turned away to speak to his lawyer. He didn't even follow as the paramedics wheeled the gurney toward the door. I was being hauled out of my own home like a piece of defective furniture, leaving behind the only life I knew in a trail of crimson drops that the maid was already beginning to scrub away. The ride to the hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic hiss of an oxygen mask. I clung to the paramedic's hand, my knuckles white, whispering a name I knew would never answer. Liam, please. I wasn't calling for the man who had just accused me of theft. I was calling for the father of the child I was losing, the man I had hallucinated into existence over 3 years of lonely nights. By the time we reached the emergency room, the physical pain had subsided into a hollow, terrifying numbness. They rushed me into a cold, brightly lit room, the sound of machines beeping and doctors shouting orders filling the air. I felt the cold sting of an IV, the intrusive pressure of an ultrasound wand, and then a silence so profound it felt like the end of the universe. The doctor, a woman with tired eyes and a soft voice, looked at the monitor and then back at me. She didn't have to say the words. The pity in her gaze was a death sentence. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Vance," she whispered, pulling the sheet over my trembling legs. "We couldn't find a heartbeat. The stress, the trauma, it was too much. You've had a complete miscarriage." I closed my eyes, a single, frozen tear sliding down my temple. I didn't scream. I didn't cry out. The grief was too heavy for sound. I had lost the only thing that made the last 3 years real. I had lost the only part of Liam that wasn't a lie. While I sat in that sterile room, shivering under a thin hospital blanket, my phone, the one thing they hadn't taken yet, buzzed on the bedside table. It was a notification from a celebrity news outlet. CEO Liam Vance finalizes divorce, announces engagement to high society heiress Sarah Jenkins. I stared at the screen, the blue light stinging my eyes. Below the headline was a photo taken just minutes ago. Liam and Sarah, glowing with success, holding champagne glasses in the very room where I had just bled. The timing was impeccable. He had waited until the sirens were out of earshot to announce his new life to the world. He was celebrating his future while I was mourning the death of ours. Suddenly, the door opened, and a police officer stepped in, his expression stern as he clutched a clipboard. "Elara Vance, the doctors say you're stable enough to talk. We need to process the felony theft charges Mr. Vance has filed against you. You have the right to remain silent." I looked at the officer, then at the empty ultrasound screen, and a cold, dead calm settled over me. The woman who loved Liam was gone. She had died on that marble floor. "Go ahead," I said, my voice as hollow as my womb. "But you should tell Mr. Vance one thing. He thinks he got everything in the divorce. He has no idea that tonight he became the poorest man on earth." The transition from the sterile hospital bed to the back of a police cruiser was a blur of gray rain and the biting cold of steel handcuffs. My body felt like an empty shell, a hollow vessel that had once carried life but now only held a cold, stagnant grief. The officer who had processed my intake at the precinct didn't look me in the eye. To him, I was just another social climber caught stealing from the man who had elevated her. They took my fingerprints, my mugshot, and finally, my dignity, as they led me to a holding cell that smelled of damp concrete and old despair. I sat on the narrow metal bench, my back against the wall, listening to the rhythmic dripping of a leaky faucet that sounded agonizingly like the ticking of the clock in Liam's study. I closed my eyes, but all I could see was the image of Liam and Sarah on that news alert, their smiles bright enough to blind me even in the darkness of this cell. The man who had once promised to be my sanctuary had become my warden, and he hadn't even had the courage to look me in the eye as he threw me to the wolves. "You don't look like a thief," a voice crackled through the silence. I opened my eyes to see a man standing on the other side of the bars. He wasn't in a uniform. He wore a rumpled gray suit and carried a leather briefcase that had seen better decades. His eyes were sharp, scanning my hospital wristband and the pale, haunted hollows of my face. "I'm Julian Thorne, public defender, or, as your husband's lawyers like to call me, a nuisance." I didn't move, my voice coming out as a dry whisper. "He's not my husband. Not anymore. The contract expired at midnight." Julian let out a low whistle, leaning against the bars. "A contract marriage, huh? Those are messy. But filing felony theft charges for a necklace that was supposedly a gift? That's not just messy, Elara. That's a hit job." Liam Vance didn't just file charges. He personally called the district attorney to request no bail. He wants you locked in here until the trial, stripped of your phone, your lawyers, and your voice. The news of the no bail order hit me harder than the arrest itself. It was a calculated move to keep me silenced while he paraded Sarah around the city. Julian pulled a file from his bag, flipping through a few pages with a frown. "I saw your medical report from the intake officer. I'm sorry about the baby. Truly." He paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked at a particular sheet. "But here's the real kicker. While you were unconscious in the ER, a private wire transfer was initiated from your personal account to Vance Global Holdings, $2 million. It looks like you authorized it via your digital signature at 2 a.m. I sat bolt upright, the pain in my body forgotten. That's impossible. I was on an operating table at 2 a.m., and I tore that check to pieces in front of him. Julian nodded grimly. "I suspected as much. Sarah Jenkins has been the CFO's assistant at Vance Global for a month. She didn't just plant that necklace. She likely used her system access to restore the check and transfer it back to Liam's company, making it look like you were returning the money as an admission of guilt for the theft." The realization turned my grief into something sharper, something colder. It wasn't just a divorce. It was a total erasure of my existence. Sarah wasn't just taking my place in his bed. She was stripping me of the only financial lifeline I had left, ensuring I'd be a penniless felon by the time I walked free. "They think I'm broken," I said, my voice finally finding its strength, a low, vibrating hum of suppressed rage. "They think I'll just rot in this cell while they plan their wedding with my money." I stood up and walked to the bars, looking Julian straight in the eyes. "I don't want a defense, Mr. Thorne. I want a war. I have 3 years' worth of Liam's private schedules, offshore accounts, and the names of the people he paid to keep Sarah's family debts out of the press. He thinks he bought my silence with a contract, but he forgot that a ghost has nothing to lose." Julian's lips curled into a predatory grin. "I was wondering when you'd wake up. It turns out Sarah isn't the only one with secrets. Her family's estate is currently under investigation for tax fraud, and she needs Liam's billions to stay out of a cell like this one. If you give me the leverage, I'll get you out of those cuffs by morning." By dawn, the no bail order had collapsed under the weight of the evidence Julian Thorne unearthed, medical records proving I was unconscious when my digital signature was voluntarily used. I walked out of the precinct not as a freed woman, but as a walking wound, draped in the same blood-stained coat I had worn when my world ended. I didn't go to a hotel or a shelter. I went back to the lion's den. I needed the one thing the security team had missed in their frantic search for the sapphires. A small, nondescript USB drive hidden inside the hollowed-out heel of my wedding shoes, containing the true records of Liam's offshore acquisitions records he had trusted me to file away when he still believed I was his loyal shadow. As the Uber dropped me at the gates of the Vance estate, the rain had turned into a thick, suffocating mist. The guards, confused by my sudden release and the cold fire in my eyes, stepped aside without a word. I didn't knock. I still had my biometric key, a privilege Liam had been too arrogant to revoke, assuming I'd be rotting in a cell for weeks. The grand foyer was eerily silent, smelling of expensive lilies and the lingering smoke of Sarah's cigarettes. I moved like a specter across the marble, my heart hammering against my ribs as I reached the master suite. The door was ajar, and for a moment I froze, expecting to see them together. Instead, I saw Liam sitting on the edge of the unmade bed, his head in his hands. The room was a mess. Sarah's designer clothes were strewn everywhere, but she was nowhere to be seen. On the nightstand, an open bottle of scotch sat next to a stack of legal documents that looked suspiciously like debt notices. Liam looked up as the floorboards creaked, his face pale and haggard. For the first time in 3 years, I saw fear in his eyes, quickly replaced by a flare of his usual icy defensive pride. "How are you here?" he rasped, his voice cracked from alcohol and lack of sleep. "You should be in custody," my lawyer said. "Your lawyers lied, Liam. Just like your fiancé did," I interrupted, my voice as cold as the hospital room where our child had died. I walked past him to the closet, my eyes fixed on the target. I found the shoes, felt the satisfying click of the hidden compartment, and tucked the drive into my palm. Only then did I turn to face him. He stood up, towering over me, but he felt smaller than he ever had. He smelled of regret and desperation. "Sarah told me you tried to bribe the officers with the money I gave you," he said, though the conviction was missing from his tone. I let out a hollow laugh that sounded like dry bones rattling. "I was in surgery losing our baby while Sarah was stealing that money back into your corporate accounts to cover her family's tax fraud. Check the timestamps, Liam. Or are you too blinded by her loyalty to see that she's looting your empire before the wedding bells even ring?" He flinched as if I had struck him, his gaze falling to the floor where a small, crumpled piece of paper lay the hospital discharge summary I had deliberately dropped. He picked it up, his fingers trembling as he read the words, "Complete miscarriage. Time of death, 2:45 a.m. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, filled with the realization of a loss he hadn't even known he had suffered. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine for the girl who used to look at him with adoration, but he found only a stranger. "Elara." "I didn't know. About the baby. I thought you were just—" He reached out, his hand hovering near my shoulder, but I stepped back, the revulsion visible on my face. "You thought I was an asset to be liquidated," I spat. "You treated our marriage like a contract, so I've decided to play by your rules. The woman who would have forgiven you died on that marble floor last night. Now, you're just a man standing in the way of my settlement." Just then, the sound of Sarah's laughter echoed from the hallway. She walked in, draped in a silk robe, her face falling the moment she saw me. "What is she doing here?" "Liam, call security!" she shrieked, her voice losing its polished high society sheen. But Liam didn't move. He was still staring at the hospital report in his hand, then back at the woman he had chosen to replace me. He looked at Sarah's designer robe, then at my blood-stained coat, and for the first time, a flicker of true, agonizing doubt crossed his face. I leaned in close to Sarah, whispering loud enough for Liam to hear, "The police are coming back, Sarah. But this time, they aren't coming for the necklace. They're coming for the $2 million you moved through an unauthorized digital signature. I hope Liam's lawyers are as good as you think they are." I walked out of the room without looking back, leaving them in the wreckage of their own lies, the USB drive clutched in my hand like a detonator. I left the mansion with the USB drive tucked against my skin, its cold weight a reminder of the power I now held. But the true weight was the silence that followed me, a silence Liam had finally entered. A week passed in a blur of sterile hotel rooms and hushed meetings with Julian Thorne. We didn't just prepare a defense, we prepared a public execution. The occasion was the Vance Global Charity Gala, the pinnacle of the New York social season and the very stage Liam had chosen to officially present Sarah as the future Mrs. Vance. As I stood before the mirror, I didn't choose the modest, submissive colors of my past. I wore a gown of deep, visceral crimson, the color of the blood I had left on his marble floor, a shade that screamed of a life stolen. I looked at my reflection and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes were hollowed by grief, but sharpened by a lethal, icy clarity. I wasn't going there to win him back. I was going there to make sure he remembered the cost of his clean break for the rest of his life. The ballroom of the Street Regis was a sea of shimmering silk and false smiles, the air thick with the scent of lilies and expensive champagne. When I walked through the arched gold doors, the music didn't stop, but the whispers did, spreading like wildfire. I moved through the crowd like a specter, my head held high even as my body screamed with the lingering ache of my loss. I saw them on the raised dais, Liam, looking regal but strangely weathered, and Sarah, draped in more diamonds than a queen, her laughter echoing too loudly, too desperately. She saw me first. Her glass stopped midair, her face draining of color until she looked like the ghost she had tried to make me. She leaned in to whisper to Liam, her hand clutching his arm with a grip that looked more like a trap than an embrace. Liam turned, his gaze colliding with mine across the expanse of the room. The air between us crackled with the memory of the hospital report, the son he had never held, and the wife he had discarded like a piece of defective equipment. Instead of retreating, I walked straight toward them, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. Every step was for the nights I spent alone, for the mother whose medical bills I had traded my soul to pay, and for the heartbeat that stopped because he couldn't be bothered to listen. As I reached the foot of the dais, the elite of the city froze. "Elara," Liam rasped, his voice a low vibration of warning, and something that sounded terrifyingly like regret. "You shouldn't be here." Sarah found her voice then, her tone a shrill, unrefined weapon. "She's a thief! Security, drag this woman out before she ruins the evening." Her outburst was too desperate, the mask of high society slipping to reveal the panicked predator underneath. "I'm not here to steal, Sarah," I said, my voice carrying through the absolute silence of the ballroom. "I'm here to settle the debt." "Liam, you always said our marriage was a transaction. You paid for my silence, for my loyalty, and for my service as the perfect wife." I pulled the USB drive from my clutch, holding it up like a detonator. "But it turns out your new partner has been skimming from the till. While you were filing charges against me, Sarah was using my forged digital signature to funnel millions into her family's offshore accounts." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Liam's face went from pale to a ghostly white. Before he could respond, the large projector screen behind them meant for a charity montage flickered to life. It showed bank statements, the forged logs, and finally, a grainy video of Sarah entering Liam's private office at 2 a.m. on the night I was in surgery. The climax arrived not with words, but with action. Sarah, realizing the walls were closing in, lunged for the laptop on the tech table, stumbling and knocking over a 5-tier champagne tower. The sound of crashing glass was the final note of her social death. She stood in the wreckage, her expensive dress soaked in wine, screaming obscenities as 2 plainclothes officers stepped out of the crowd. I leaned in, my voice a whisper that only Liam could hear over the chaos. "The contract is over, Liam. But look at what you traded your son for. A thief in a soaked dress." As the police led a shrieking Sarah away, Liam reached for me, his eyes brimming with a sudden agonizing realization of his own blindness. I didn't let him touch me. I simply turned and walked out of the street, Regis, leaving the red of my dress to burn in his memory forever. I didn't stay to watch the police lead Sarah out of the street, Regis, nor did I stay to watch the elite of Manhattan scramble to distance themselves from the wreckage of Vance Global. The satisfaction I had expected the warmth of justice served was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was only a hollow, echoing coldness that settled deep into my marrow. I hailed a taxi to the outskirts of the city, to a quiet, wind-swept cemetery where the grass was long and the silence was absolute. I stepped out, the crimson silk of my gown trailing behind me like a fresh wound against the somber gray of the headstones. I walked until I reached a small, nameless plot in the far corner, a patch of earth so fresh the grass hadn't yet dared to grow. I knelt, my expensive heels sinking into the damp mud, and for the first time since the contract ended, the wall I had built around my heart finally crumbled into the dirt. The heavy, oppressive silence was suddenly shattered by the frantic buzzing of the phone in my clutch. I didn't have to look at the screen to know who it was. The notifications were relentless, a barrage of missed calls and frantic texts from the man who had discarded me like a broken toy only a week ago. I pulled the device out and stared at the name. Liam. The irony was a jagged blade in my throat. I remembered being in that cold hospital bathroom, clutching this same phone as I dialed his number with blood-slicked fingers, begging for him to pick up while he was busy putting a diamond on Sarah's finger. Back then, I would have traded my soul for him to answer. Now, his name on my screen was a ghost I no longer feared. I let it ring, the shrill sound echoing through the cemetery, a digital scream for help that arrived 3 days too late. Suddenly, the sound of a car door slamming echoed from the iron gates, followed by the heavy, purposeful stride of leather shoes on gravel. I didn't turn around. I knew that walk. Liam stopped a few feet behind me, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his tuxedo disheveled and his tie torn open. The regal CEO of Vance Global was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he had crawled out of his own ruin. "Elara," he whispered, his voice stripped of its arrogance, trembling with a raw, agonizing desperation. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me and the tiny mound of earth. I could smell the champagne from the gala still lingering on his breath, a sickening reminder of what he had been celebrating while I was burying our future. "I went to the hospital," he rasped, dropping to his knees beside me. He didn't care about his $1,000 suit or the mud staining his knees. He looked at the tiny marble plaque I had placed there, a simple stone that read, "Baby Vance, forever unheld." His eyes widened, and he let out a choked, guttural sound that was half sob, half scream. "I didn't know. Elara, I swear on my life, I didn't know there was a child. They told me you were faking. Sarah said you were just trying to trap me." I turned to face him then, my eyes as dead as the stones around us. "You believed a woman you had a contract with over the woman who shared your bed for 3 years, Liam. You trusted a balance sheet more than my heartbeat. And this is the result." I pulled my phone out as it began to ring again, another call from him. I held the screen up to his face so he could see his own name flashing, a desperate signal of a man drowning in his own regret. "Remember this sound, Liam," I whispered, my voice as cold as the wind. "Remember the sound of a call that will never be answered. Just like the one I made to you from the hallway while our son was dying." With a slow, deliberate motion, I dropped the phone onto the grave, letting the dirt swallow the glowing screen. I stood up, the red silk of my dress muddied and torn, and walked away without looking back. Behind me, I heard the sound of him wailing, his forehead pressed against the wet earth, calling a name that no longer belonged to anyone in his world. The warmth in my eyes hadn't just disappeared, it had been buried, and Liam Vance was the one who had shoveled the earth. I didn't look back as I walked through the iron gates of the cemetery, leaving the sound of Liam's guttural grief to be swallowed by the Atlantic wind. The red gown, once a symbol of my defiance at the gala, now felt like a heavy, blood-soaked shroud that I couldn't wait to burn. I took a flight out of New York that same night, not to a tropical escape, but to a small, secluded town in coastal Maine where the fog was thick enough to hide 1,000 past lives. While I settled into a modest cottage perched on a jagged cliff, the world I had left behind began to incinerate in a spectacular, public display of karma. From my laptop, I watched the digital embers glow from 300 miles away. Julian Thorne had been surgically efficient. The offshore files from the USB drive were leaked to the federal authorities and the press in a controlled explosion. The headlines were a relentless drumbeat of ruin. Vance Global assets frozen, CEO Liam Vance ousted amidst felony forgery scandal, and the one that felt like a cold breath of justice, Sarah Jenkins indicted on 14 counts of fraud, faces 20 years in federal prison. Back in the Manhattan mansion, Liam had become a prisoner of his own making. Without Sarah's toxic manipulations, and without my quiet, stabilizing presence to steer the helm, the grand house on the hill had turned into a hollow mausoleum. He had fired the entire staff, unable to bear the weight of their pitying glances, and spent his nights wandering through the darkened hallways I used to fill with flowers. Reports from Julian told me that Liam had stopped attending board meetings, his legendary focus shattered. He reportedly sat for hours in the darkened nursery he had once planned to renovate for Sarah's future, staring at the empty floor where the child he ignored should have slept. He had spent his entire life building an empire of glass and steel, believing that everything, including love and loyalty, had a price tag. Now, he was finding out that the things he truly needed, the things that kept a man sane in the dark, were the only things he couldn't buy back. He sent me letters by the hundreds, all returned to sender unopened, and offered me the entire Vance estate as a settlement. He was trying to negotiate with a ghost, failing to realize that I didn't want his billions, I wanted the 3 years of my soul back. One evening, a month into my exile, the fog lifted just enough for me to see a dark figure standing near the cliff's edge. My heart skipped a beat, a phantom reflex from a life I had buried, but it wasn't Liam. It was Julian Thorne. He didn't come to bring me back. He came to bring me the finality I needed to truly breathe. We sat on the porch, the sound of the ocean crashing against the rocks below providing the only soundtrack to our meeting. "He's lost the company, Elara," Julian said, handing me a manila envelope, the same kind Liam had used to serve me the divorce on that midnight deadline. The mansion is being seized by creditors next week. Sarah is already testifying against him to shave a few years off her sentence. He's utterly alone. I looked at the papers inside. They weren't legal threats. They were the original, unredacted contract from 3 years ago. Liam had sent it with a single note scrawled in his jagged, desperate handwriting. "You were never an employee. I was the one who was bankrupt from the start. Please, just tell me where he is buried." I stared at the note, but it didn't stir the old longing or the familiar ache. The man who wrote those words was a stranger, a shadow of a memory that no longer held any power over my future. I realized then that Liam's true punishment wasn't the loss of his money or his social standing. It was the fact that he was finally, agonizingly awake. He had to live the rest of his life with the absolute clarity of what he had destroyed. He would see my face in every silent room, hear the ghost of our son's heartbeat in the ticking of every clock, and feel the coldness of that marble floor every time he closed his eyes. He was trapped in the clean break he had fought so hard to achieve. He was free, and he was utterly, devastatingly hollow. "What will you do now?" Julian asked. I looked out at the horizon where the first stars were piercing the twilight. I picked up a lighter and held it to the corner of the contract. I watched the orange flames lick at the word agreement, turning the names Vance and Elara into black ash. I watched until the wind caught the remains, scattering the dust of our transaction into the dark water. "I'm going to do the one thing Liam can never do," I whispered, feeling the first true breath of air in my lungs for years. "I'm going to forget he ever existed." A year had passed since the ashes of my marriage contract were scattered into the Atlantic, and the name Liam Vance had been buried under the quiet life of a woman named Elena. I had moved further north, settling in a coastal town in Maine, where the locals didn't recognize my face from the tabloid scandals of Manhattan. I worked in the local library, a sanctuary of oak shelves and the comforting scent of old paper. My days were measured by the shifting tides and the simple kindness of people who didn't know I was a woman who had once bled out her soul on a marble floor. I believed the erasure was complete, that I had successfully performed the miracle of forgetting a man who had once been my entire world. I had found a fragile peace, a version of myself that no longer checked the clock at midnight. The illusion shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. I was shelving books in the back corner when I saw him. He was sitting at a small table near the window, his back to me, hunched over a collection of architectural journals. At first, I told myself it was impossible. Liam Vance was a man of steel skyscrapers, not dusty libraries in forgotten towns. But as he turned his head, the profile I had memorized over 3 years of longing and betrayal carved itself into the air. He looked a decade older. The sharp, predatory edge of his jaw was hidden under a weary beard, and his bespoke suit had been replaced by a simple, worn wool coat. He looked like a man who had spent a year walking through a desert, searching for a drop of rain he knew he didn't deserve. I stood frozen, the floorboards cold beneath my feet. My first instinct was to slip out the back door, to remain a ghost. But as I watched, he pulled a small, weathered photograph from his pocket, the one from our wedding day that I had left in the hallway. He didn't look at it with pride. He looked at it with a devastating, quiet intensity, his thumb tracing the silhouette of my face as if trying to summon a spirit. He wasn't there for the books. He had used what remained of his life to track a woman who had promised to forget him. I stepped into the light, my footsteps echoing in the silent room. He froze, his entire body tensing. When he turned to face me, the look in his eyes wasn't triumph. It was a humble, terrifying relief that nearly brought me to my knees. We stood in silence for a long heartbeat, the dust motes dancing between us like the ghosts of the years we had wasted. He didn't move toward me, respecting the invisible boundary of my exile. "Elena," he whispered, using my new name like a sacred prayer. "I'm not here to ask you to come back. I know the woman I loved, the woman I broke, is gone." He reached into his pocket and pushed a small, wooden box across the table. "I spent the last 12 months finding the things you sold. I tracked down the locket your mother gave you. I bought back the family photos the bank seized. I put them all in a trust in your name. You never have to see me again, but you should have what is yours." I looked at the box, then at the man who had once been my executioner. I realized then that I felt nothing, no rage, no longing, just a profound, empty pity. I don't want the things that belong to the past, Liam, I said, my voice steady and clear. I walked to the table, picked up the wedding photograph, and placed it face down. Then, I reached into the box and took only the gold locket, the only thing in this world that didn't have his signature on it. You think buying back my memories makes up for the heartbeat you ignored. But you can't buy back a soul, and you can't negotiate with a grave. I turned to walk away, but stopped at the door, looking back one last time. He was still standing there, framed by the setting Maine sun, looking smaller than I ever thought possible. The contract is null and void, Liam. Not because you're bankrupt, but because I finally value myself more than your apology. I stepped out into the crisp evening air, leaving him in the silence he had built for himself. As I walked toward the ocean, I felt the weight of the last 3 years finally lift. He would spend the rest of his life as a prisoner of his regret, while I would live mine in the light. The midnight deadline had passed, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I walked away from the library without a second glance, the heavy oak doors groaning shut behind me like the final, ironclad chapter of a life I had finally outgrown. The crisp Maine air filled my lungs, sharp and honest, a stark contrast to the suffocating, artificial luxury of the mansion in Manhattan. I felt the gold locket, my mother's only legacy, pressed firmly against my palm, its metal warm from the heat of my skin. It was the only piece of the past I allowed myself to carry, no longer a burden of debt, but a symbol of a soul reclaimed. Behind me, inside that quiet sanctuary of books, Liam remained a silhouette of profound regret, a man who had spent a fortune to buy back trinkets, failing to realize that the woman who valued them had been replaced by someone he could never influence again. I didn't head straight home. Instead, I walked toward the jagged cliffs where the Atlantic crashed against the shore with a violent, cleansing persistence. The sunset had bled into a deep, bruised purple, and the first evening stars were beginning to pierce through the gathering mist, indifferent to the dramas of men. As I stood at the edge of the cliff, watching the dark water churn below, I felt a strange, solid sense of equilibrium. For months, I had lived in fear of this encounter, terrified that seeing Liam would rip open the scars and pull me back into the cold, gravitational field of his power. But as the wind whipped around me, I realized that the man in the library was no longer a king. He was just a ghost haunting his own ruins. The hold he once had over me was built on the lie that I needed his validation to be whole. Now, that lie was dust. I slipped the locket around my neck, feeling its light weight settle against my heart. I thought about the box he had pushed across the table, the photos, the jewels, the remnants of Liam Vance. They would likely sit in that lost-and-found bin until the library closed, just as Liam would sit in the silence of his hollow life until the walls forgot his name. The walk back to my cottage was peaceful, the path illuminated by the soft glow of the moon reflecting off the damp moss. When I reached my porch, I saw a familiar figure waiting for me in the shadows. It was Julian Thorne. He was leaning against the railing, his silhouette sharp against the white wood of the house. He had been the architect of my disappearance, the one who had navigated the legal minefields to ensure my freedom remained absolute. "He found you," Julian said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that blended with the sound of the surf. He didn't sound surprised, only weary. I stepped onto the porch and took a seat in the wicker chair, the wood creaking familiarly. He did. But he didn't find the woman he was looking for. He found a stranger. Julian let out a short, dry laugh, finally lighting a cigarette. The small orange flame flickered in the dark. I told him it was a mistake. I told him that some bridges don't just burn, they evaporate into smoke. But a man like Liam Vance spent his whole life believing every no was just a negotiation starting point. He had to hear it from you to believe that he's finally lost the only thing that wasn't for sale. We sat in silence for a long time, the smoke curling into the cold night air. Julian looked at me, his eyes reflecting a quiet respect. He spent 3 days at the cemetery before he came here, Elara. He sat by that small grave until the police told him to move. He's back in New York now, or what's left of it. Sarah is officially turning on him in court next week, but he doesn't seem to care. He's a man who has realized that his empire was just a very expensive cage. "What will you do, Julian?" I asked, looking at the man who had seen me at my absolute lowest. He exhaled a long cloud of smoke, staring at the horizon. "I'm going back to finish the job. I'll make sure Sarah stays where she belongs and that Liam's creditors leave you out of the fallout. After that, maybe I'll find a quiet place like this." He stood up, flicking the ash into the wind. "You're free, Elara. Truly free. Don't let his shadow reach this far again." I watched him walk down the path, his figure disappearing into the fog just as Liam's had so many times before. But this time, I didn't feel the urge to call out or follow. I went inside my cottage, the warmth of the fireplace greeting me like a long-lost friend. I poured myself a glass of tea and sat by the window, listening to the house settle. For the first time in 4 years, I wasn't waiting for a car to pull up. I wasn't checking the time for a deadline. I was just a woman in a quiet house, and the silence was no longer a prison, it was a song. The seasons in Maine passed with a deliberate, slow grace that the glass canyons of Manhattan could never understand. Another year had melted away, and the memory of the library, the wooden box, and the broken man in the wool coat had settled into the deep, quiet recesses of my mind. I had stopped looking for Liam's shadow in the coastal fog. I had stopped expecting the heavy hand of a process server to knock on my door at midnight. I was no longer Elara, the contract wife, nor was I Elena, the ghost in hiding. I had finally become just myself. My garden, once a patch of rocky, stubborn soil, was now a vibrant sanctuary of lavender and white roses colors that didn't remind me of blood or the cold glitter of sapphires. But the past has a way of leaving one final ripple, not as a destructive storm, but as a soft, persistent tide. It came in the form of a thick, cream-colored envelope, hand-delivered not by a lawyer, but by a local courier who simply smiled and wished me a peaceful afternoon. I sat on my porch, the wicker chair groaning softly as I broke the seal. Inside was a single, final document from the Vance Legacy Trust. My first instinct was a flare of the old familiar fire, the defensive thought that Liam was still trying to buy his way into my thoughts. But as I read the words, the anger dissolved into a profound, hollow silence. The trust wasn't a gift of money, nor was it a bribe for a forgiveness he knew I couldn't give. It was a total dissolution. Liam had officially liquidated every asset remaining in his name, the mansion where our child was lost, the remaining shares of his broken empire, even the private collections he had once prized above all else. Every cent had been donated to a global foundation for maternal health and emergency grief counseling, specifically for women who had suffered trauma in isolation. The trust was now closed. There was nothing left to manage and no one left to sue. At the bottom was a brief, handwritten note from Julian Thorne. "He's gone, Elara. Not from the world, but from the life you knew. He joined a humanitarian mission in a conflict zone 6 months ago. No phones, no boardrooms, no power. He left you the only thing he had left, the absolute certainty that you will never have to see his face again." I let the paper rest on my lap, looking out at the vast, unchanging Atlantic. The finality of it hit me with a weight that was surprisingly light. Liam hadn't just given me my freedom. He had finally recognized that his presence was the only poison left in my life. By choosing to disappear into a world of service, he had performed the only selfless act of our entire history. He had accepted that he was the villain in my story and had finally removed himself from the script. I thought about the man who once believed he could buy a heartbeat with a contract, now possibly standing in a dusty clinic half a world away, far from the marble floors and the ticking clocks. I didn't feel joy at his exile, nor did I feel pity. I felt a strange, quiet respect for the courage it took for a man of his ego to voluntarily become a ghost. He had finally honored the midnight deadline in the only way that mattered. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the waves in hues of gold and amber, I walked down to the center of my garden. I dug a small hole in the earth near my most resilient rose bushes. I took the document, the final tie to the name Vance, and placed it into the soil. I didn't burn it this time. I let the earth take it. I covered it with fresh compost and planted a new seedling of white jasmine on top. I stood up and wiped the dirt from my hands, the gold locket around my neck catching the last light of the day. The silence of the cottage was no longer the silence of a prison or a sanctuary. It was simply the silence of a home. I went inside and closed the door, the click of the lock sounding like a period at the end of a very long, convoluted sentence. The story of the contract was over. The debt had been paid in full, the ink was dry, and as I turned off the light, I realized I was finally, beautifully free.